So the 70s are going to bring about kind of this conservative backlash, right? And you really have kind of a remaking of the definitions of what is conservative and what is liberal. And understand that going back to kind of the early 20th century, right? I mean, the progressive era had seen progressive conservatives and, really ironically, kind of less progressive Democrats, right? And so you still had between Roosevelt and Taft and Wilson, you had all progressive guys, right? And certainly when you're talking about the 1920s, the Republicans were absolutely kind of this party of small government, of low taxes, of big business, but they were not remotely interested in controlling people's social behavior, right? They were not about that life. And so really you kind of have this interesting switch, right? Great Depression happens and FDR comes in and it's all about government action. And you start to have a shift in what it means to be a Democrat, what it means to be liberal, right? And so the term liberal and the affiliation of liberal with Democrat happens under FDR. Um, Eisenhower, Truman's kind of considered a liberal Democrat, but he kind of loses in popularity. Eisenhower comes in. Eisenhower is immensely popular. And Eisenhower, interestingly, he's absolutely a Republican. He's absolutely conservative, right? So he's very specific. When he talks about using government, it's very targeted, right? So Eisenhower is actually, you would call him almost more of a progressive conservative, in a very kind of small way. So Eisenhower, while he was absolutely Republican, absolutely conservative in many ways, he was a little bit progressive. I mean, you see that with the Interstate Highway Act. You see that with his support of integration, and so he does these things that actually are fairly progressive. Kennedy comes in, and Kennedy, ironically, right, is actually a little less progressive than you would think, right? I mean, he talks a big game of progressivism and of kind of liberal values, and he certainly believes in liberalism in a theoretical sense and free speech and democracy. But when you start talking about social programs or civil rights, he was a little more conservative than that. LBJ is going to be the one that's going to come in and really kind of change kind of even further. He's going to take that New Deal kind of idea and take it to a new level. So beginning in the mid 60s, liberalism is going to be about government intervention, right? Government should intervene in the economy to create fairness, to create equality, and that the government really doesn't need to control your individual behavior, right? So very specific kind of ways in which the government is supposed to take action. And it's also kind of in the 70s then that you have the realignment of conservatism that had been there in the 50s when you saw the Red Scare, when you saw the focus on conformity, and you saw the kind of some of the patriotic Christianity that comes out of the 50s, the In God We Trust stuff, right? And that had kind of taken a lull in the 60s and 70s, and really comes back with a vengeance in the 80s. Or sorry, yeah, in the 80s, where they come in and they say we don't like government involvement in the economy. We don't trust the government because they try to become the moral code, and it should be people's individual faith, and we should have economic freedom, and and all this kind of stuff, right? And so they really want to come and interfere, or want to stop that interference of the government in all those things. But they also are okay with controlling certain social behavior, with controlling drug use, controlling women's reproduction, and you kind of have some interesting developments there. Now, typically conservatism is very much about global democracy, about opposing communism, tends to take a very action-based view of our role in the world, whereas liberalism tends to be a little more like we shouldn't get involved. What we see in the 21st century is that has shifted a little bit, but this is kind of the basic definition as we're moving into the 20th century. Again, the conservatives had begun to gain support in the 50s in reaction to FDR and Truman, with McCarthyism and all that kind of stuff. Eisenhower was kind of able to keep those on the back burner a little bit, but they're there, and they start to really be more vocal. And so you see with them kind of coming into being in the 50s. By the time you get to the 60s, you have pushback against social movements. Barry Goldwater in 64 runs on kind of, that extremism and the defense of liberty is no vice, right? And he's, very much against, communism and very much a war hawk, that kind of thing. And very much against kind of government interference. George Wallace will run in 1968. He's the segregation now, segregation forever kind of guy. And he's going to be a big part of kind of pulling the South away from the Democratic Party. And then you're going to have Nixon, right, who will come in and kind of co-opt kind of that Wallace coalition, and really kind of begin to talk about law and order, and really kind of talk about kind of restoring, talks about the silent majority, about the majority of people that don't go out and protest and don't want to change everything, and that he's representing them, right? So you start to have that conservative movement, and then, of course, the South begins to vote that way, and you begin to have a lot of focus on, we don't need the government to come in and do things. We want individualism. We want local control. A lot of the suburbs get irritated with tax burdens, and lots of frustration over city issues. And religious groups become very engaged in politics. Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority is a big part of that. Jerry Falwell will be very politically active, endorse political candidates, which his son still does. Phyllis Schlafly, that's a whole nother thing. We're going to talk about her in class because she is interesting. Then you have Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan comes from the California political machine, comes in. He almost won the nomination in 76, definitely wins in 1980, resoundingly beats Carter because Carter was not very popular, promises a new day in America. He's going to fix the economy. And so he does, right? He basically comes in. He issues in this Reaganomics. Has a short period where he really controls interest rates to stop inflation, and then he starts to cut taxes, and you start to have what he calls the trickle down effect. This is essentially supply side economics that we heard about in the 1920s, where you have you collect less in taxes, but you reduce the size of government, and so that's meant to kind of help things. He deregulates a lot. In order to let businesses just do their thing. You have the weakening of unions to kind of decrease the power of unions. And eventually the economy recovers, right? And the economy kind of bounces back. Is it because of Reaganomics, or was it going to happen anyways? It's probably a little bit of both. Ultimately, Reaganomics is going to have really negative implications for families, for women of color, for women in general, because he's going to slash a lot of government programs, a lot of urban programs that were addressing poverty. And so the wealth gap is going to start to really become a major issue. And it still is today, right? And we haven't really fixed that yet. And it all that kind of change comes about, the change in higher education funding. The reason why many of us have to have student loans to go to school is because of Ronald Reagan and the way he starts deregulating and cutting funding for public education. And so again, the Cold War, he really kind of takes a hard line against the Soviet Union. And as taking a hard line against the Soviet Union, he's going to talk about, withdrawing from the nuclear arms treaties, the strategic defense initiative, all those kinds of things to kind of encourage military spending. So the irony of his Reaganomics is he's going to cut taxes and cut domestic programs, but we're going to spend a bunch more money on the military, right, and on anti-communism. And that's going to lead to some issues with the Iran-Contra affair, where we're basically sending weapons through Iran into Nicaragua, and it's just kind of a hot mess. He does put the first female Supreme Court justice, Sandra Day O'Connor, conservative woman, but she gets on the Supreme Court. He'll win in 1984 as well. 1984 is when you have the first female vice presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. And it's really in 1984 that you start to see the Democratic Party begins to look a little bit different. Gone is the new left, is the liberalism of LBJ and FDR. And you start to have a much more conservative Democratic Party. This is going to be the Democratic Party of the Clintons, right? That really kind of represents moderation and centrism and that kind of thing. And so, he's, under Reagan, you've got the war on drugs and kind of the implications of that, although you can really blame Clinton for a lot of it. And I kind of mentioned already his foreign policy, his concept of peace through strength. If we build up our military, then the Soviets will never attack us. And all of this puts a lot of pressure on the Soviet Union. So eventually, the Soviet Union kind of collapses under the weight. And Gorbachev is a part of this, and it's a little more complicated than that. You've got Gorbachev trying to open up. The economy of the Soviet Union is kind of stalled out and stagnated, and so he's trying to usher in some changes. And as he's trying to do that, what ends up happening is, he ends up opening up society, and then that just the snowball starts, and he can't stop kind of the end of the Soviet Union and the end of communism. And so, really, the 1980s, ultimately, after that stagflation of the 70s and the kind of first year or two of the 80s, you'll have this economic boom. This idea that greed is good, business is good. You're going to see a decline in manufacturing, a focus on retail, on service, on restaurants, being professional. Again, kind of pop culture videos, music videos, cell phones, right? Your early computers, your personal computers, right? Start to become a thing. And really, technology becomes a huge part of this society. And so lots of changes in the 80s. But like I said, the slashing government programs is going to lead to a wealth gap. You're going to have crime and drugs and alcohol that are going to create problems. And artists and musicians will really call attention to that. And so it's in the context of this 80s, of this kind of conservative resurgence and this kind of realigning of what it means to be conservative, that women are going to become very active, right? And women will be a part of this conservative movement. Phyllis Schlafly, of course, is going to be one, and lots of Republican women who are running. Nancy Reagan, right? This kind of picture of kind of appropriate female political action, and kind of that women don't want the interference of the government. They don't need the government to act on their behalf. And it's into this environment that you have that rejection of the Equal Rights Amendment. As well as kind of a disinterest in promoting equal pay and equal wages and that sort of thing. It's during the 1980s. Women don't have any protections on if they get pregnant, to prevent them from losing their jobs. I mean, it's going to take all of those things. Like it takes time to get those things fixed, right? And ultimately, you're going to see that. That the 80s will ultimately result in kind of, almost women kind of retreating back a little bit. So you had, all that movement with Now and Black Power and Angela Davis and that kind of thing. And really the 80s will see women kind of moving to the background again. And, they're working. You have more women working. You have higher divorce rates. All of those things are taking place. So women are having independence. They're participating, but it's just not out in the open, right? And so there's going to be some issues that will pop up because of that. And we'll talk about that in class.